free to get up and get pizza, waters. This is very, informal. We just wanted to make sure that we had a time today where we could come together. You could ask questions. You could share concerns because, for the last year that we have had elder mini lessons on what we believe and how Scripture defines how church is supposed to look. And the main thing that we focused on here is, and I think this is different from a lot of the churches that we've been in. That's not bad, it's just different. But as we prayed through this together, as we talked through this together, it became clear as we read 1 Timothy, as we read Titus, as we read 1 Peter, as we read Acts, that the names pastor, elder, overseer, and bishop are the same office. It's the same. It's all the same. They're used interchangeably. So what we believe that means then is for men here that aspire, that feel called to be an elder, that they're serving in the same position. So I think in the past what you've been used to probably is you have the pastor and then you have the elder board who kind of gets together every 2 weeks or once a month. But we believe that if we're called to do this, and remember, anyone that wants to be a part of leadership, that feels called, that's been praying through this, we have till December 2nd, correct? December 2nd to put your name in. So please, pray through that. But what we believe Scripture clearly defines is that it's the same office. And I think what, like I said, we've been used to is maybe pastor, elders, but we believe the Lord makes clear that all of us are called to shepherd, to pastor, to teach, rebuke, anyone that's going to be in leadership. I believe the Scripture makes clear on that. So I'm sure some questions have been raised in your mind. What's this going to look like? And I think just as we prayed through the possibility, okay, here is how Scripture defines this. Now what does this look like practically? Because still, as it's been, for the most part, Rick and myself are going to be the ones that are available throughout the week. But probably for the rest of folks who feel called and aspire to be an elder, it's going to be, we can be available some, but they work full-time jobs. So what's that going to look like? But we want to give you a time just to ask questions, just to share your comments. Maybe you've been through this before. Maybe you've seen some things that maybe we're not thinking about, but just a time for you to speak up and share your thoughts as well. Any other thoughts, gentlemen, that you want to share? Okay, all right. So feel free to ask questions. I guess. Yeah.
Are you guys going to rotate doing the sermons?
As of now, the plan is to still 8 weeks where I preach, and then take 2 weeks off, and then other people will fill the pulpit.
Would you repeat questions as they're asked?
Sure. She asked who was going to take primarily the preaching responsibility. Was it still going to be the same, or were we going to rotate that out? So, yeah. And we still will give, people opportunities to do that. So. Yeah, Richard?
Many churches have a certain number of elders or deacons or whatever they have. Has there been established a number? How are you going to determine which group with the process?
Yeah, so Richard's question was number of elders. Probably right now we don't have a set number. Now there is a minimum, but I don't foresee us having a set maximum. I kind of view it as if men feel called to lead, and that's their calling, then we're not going to put a limit on that. Now, that could change, if we're a church of this size, and I don't know, that's a great question, but as of now, there is no limit. Any other questions?
What were the questions that Madonna had? Can you share those with us again?
I think one was can you further define what the roles would be? Like if you have pastor elder you know what roles are what, I think is what, if I got that right.
And I think primarily we'll have to think through as to what this looks like, particularly through, folks that work a full-time job. But as I mentioned earlier, Rick and I, will still be available to do the day-to-day things, and anything that comes up, we will still be available to be able to do that.
So the question was specific roles for each pastor elder, correct? Well, I don't know if we'll designate specific roles. I think what we'll find is when each man comes, he's gifted in a certain area. Now, clearly, one of Sam's major things is preaching week to week. So that'll take up his time. I think what we do is we look at it as, look, we're all called to shepherd the sheep. So that includes everything. Now, some men will be gifted in that area more so than others. And so I think you might see that more prominent in specific areas. But that doesn't, if you're not as gifted in that area, that doesn't mean you don't get to do it. So as far as specific roles, we don't have any defined yet. I think, like I mentioned, as men come on board, maybe they'll have strengths in some area, and we're going to build into those strengths and let them do it. With the leadership team, Conrad is great with sound and figuring all that stuff out, and we're not. So, we don't try to say, no, let's do it this way when he knows better. So I think each man will just have a gift in an area, and we want them to play into that strength, so we feel that that's why God has brought them to the team.
I think her other question is, like, what are the checks and balances? Like, I think she said from past, she felt like, what if one of the guys says, oh, well, I feel like I could be a better head pastor? Like, what is the value, or what are the checks and balances amongst the pastor elders? I think was another question.
So checks and balances amongst the pastor elders. The example was that maybe someone said, hey, I could be a better senior pastor. Well, there's there'll be a checks and balance amongst the pastor elder team going through and evaluating roles. And there's, those would fall in line with what we've gone over in Timothy and Titus. Are we continuing to meet these qualifications and characteristics? But then even also on top of that is, so the first vote, which we'll have February 10th, will be a confirmation vote by everyone here. And the pass-fail is 80%. So we're setting a pretty high standard on those who you think will govern and lead and be a servant. After that, every 2 years, there's a vote of affirmation. Now, the difference between confirmation and affirmation is the first time you guys are selecting and passing these along. After that, the pastor elder board will, pick and kind of push along new pastor elders. But every 2 years, there's a vote of affirmation. And that affirmation is 80% as well. And that goes for everyone up here, including Sam, who will be preaching week to week. And that's a high standard. Now, if someone falls below 80% at that time, that doesn't mean they're automatically removed. But what it does mean is we're going to stop and we're going to, look into why has it fallen below that. And so that's kind of what we have in place for kind of making sure things don't get out of whack. Now, specifically to the question about, will someone say I'm a better senior pastor? I think going in, we kind of know that role that, hey, that's Sam on a week-to-week basis. Unless Sam would be disqualified, then, going forward, I don't see that happening. That's a great question, and that's something we can think about as well, as maybe to add language into our pastor elder document.
So it's important to understand that when we come together and meet as a leadership team up to this point, like if we've come to a decision, and let's say 3 of us are on board, 2 of us aren't, 4 of us are on board, 1 of us aren't, then we decided as a group that anything that God is leading us to do, we want to be unified in. because we believe the scripture is clear on that. So there's been a couple times where we've seen some things different through this process. And so we decided, okay, we're going to pray through this together, and then we've come back a second time, and we've all been on the same page by the grace of God. So when we're making decisions like that, we believe the scripture makes clear we're to be unified in that. Just so you're clear on that part as well.
Just to clarify, I guess, again, on the whole pastor elder role, just to talk about that, meetings, we had numerous meetings over, everything being the same office. And what are we going to call that office? Is it pastor? Is it elder? We went over and over and over and over and over this a lot. But it was funny because the very first thing we said was pastor elder. The very last thing we came back and said was pastor elder. So again, that's kind of what sandwich is an example that we don't take anything lightly. And again, if we're not unified on it, we're not going to go forward with it. Then also, just to go back on like the roles, I think it's pretty clear on role, like Sam being the main teaching pastor. Like Rick, his gifts obviously in the financials administrative. Same with Chris. Conrad's our techie guru. Without him, we wouldn't have any of this stuff happening. And then like with me, I got more of a servant's heart. I love the people. I love talking to people, ministering to people. I am not an administrative financial guru, and somewhat of a techie guy, but not to the near as Conrad. So it's kind of already kind of defined, each role happening there. But what we want to make the point is it's all on the same level. Okay, it's a pastor, elder. We look at a lot of us we talk about Titus and Timothy a lot, and we've heard it say numerous times. When it calls it says pastor, elder, overseer, bishop. It's all the same office. And so when it comes to that responsibility, we're going to share that. When it comes to shepherding the people. Now obviously, when it comes to more administrative roles and stuff in the background, that's where we'll have different responsibilities and roles. But when it comes to shepherding the church, that's where it's all people. Does that make sense?
So right now it's five people that are in consideration, or you said minimum, I didn't know.
The minimum was, I think it had to deal with the state of Indiana. We had to put together a document, so the minimum we could have, I think, was 4. But yeah, so as far as minimum, I think 4 or 5, but maximum, no. I see Margie, you have a question?
Yeah, so I like the idea. I just wonder, will there be training for you guys to protect, to help you mature in protecting your leadership? Will you be going through some training? Because I know that shepherding can be very taxing. So that's my question.
Yeah, so the question was, would the pastor elders do training? And yes. Currently, our meetings, we meet twice a month, and in that we have time for prayer and time for Bible study. So we do that, but yes, we will do further training, and we just kind of go through and figure out, okay, what do we think is good? If you guys have been through that and you have suggestions, we're all ears on that as well.
The other thing too, if you guys notice in the budget, we did put stuff in there for conferences, a budget out for conferences. That way, not all of us will always be able to go, but that gives us some extra training and something we can go to, just like anything else, just to keep things fresh. So there is that. And when Rick brings out the budget for the next year, you'll see it there again. So that's another avenue as well.
And Sam mentioned there's so through this process, we looked at a lot of churches. One was Capitol Hill Baptist in Washington, D.C., which is Mark Dever's church. He also has an organization called 9 Marks. And they have what they call a weekender, where churches, I think it's the first 5 years, they kind of put together a weekender, a 2 or 3 day conference to go to. And so 2 of us will be going to that. It's either in this spring or this fall. So yeah.
I think part of the that's more of the formal side. I think part of the more informal stuff too is going to be hopefully finding a way to have regular evaluations of ourselves too, which I think is important, and regular evaluations from all of you. I mean, and again, I shouldn't speak that way because none of us have been voted on yet, but when the people who become the pastor elders ultimately we're trying to build in ongoing evaluation. So the idea there would be based off of 1 Timothy and Titus, looking at those and basically expanding on those. The handout that was, were those given out there? Okay, yeah. So the idea is we're going to basically have questions, sort of self-assessment, self-evaluation questions that spring from those things in terms of making sure that people generally have an outlook of self-discipline. They're able to teach. They lead their family well, and those sorts of things. And so, ideally, we'll have maybe a formal evaluation at least every year or two. But on an informal level, we would be going through those questions regularly. And one of the things we've built in for ourselves as we kind of go through this candidacy process, but anybody new that would be going through this candidacy process, we would give them the self-assessment questions and say, okay, how do you think you're doing in these areas? Where can you grow? And so the idea there being not only would there be growth in terms of doctrinal and teaching standpoints, growth in terms of sort of formal pastoral ministry and shepherding, but also just character growth, saying, okay, I'm really struggling with self-control in certain areas, and maybe I need to work on that. And having, ideally, hopefully what we're building is an environment where people will be comfortable and transparent enough to say, this is where I'm struggling, this is an area I see in your life that maybe could really grow. And so all that's difficult when it comes down to personal sins and so on, but I think that's the culture we're hoping to build for whoever takes on these tasks, just to make sure that we're constantly growing, not only in sort of the training characteristics of the functions, but also just our character in general. So that's still in a early phase in the progress, but you're right, it's an important part that we don't have a mindset of once the person becomes a pastor elder that they're adequately trained and they don't have to continue to improve, but hopefully we're building a mentality that's one of continual growth and education and training and learning, that no matter where someone is in that process, they can continue to grow closer to the Lord. So I think it's a great point.
Are spouses on board with the men that are, because I know that on this kind of situation, it has to be spouses on board as well, because it'll take time away from family. Is that something that is required or measured in some way?
So the question is, where do spouses fit into this? In an ideal circumstance, they would be on board with this view of ministry, but if they're not, would there be provisions for that or caveats for that? So speaking from my perspective, so I had the privilege of being an elder at Southside Bible Church, and I would say Alicia and I probably took a good 6 or 7 months before we ever made the decision even to pursue it or consider it, because we just really wanted to work through what does this look like. And so I think for us early on, we had the conviction that it looked more like this. And so we wanted to make sure, if we're going to do this, we want to make sure we have the right outlook on it. So that's I think our personal story related to it. I guess if someone came to me and said I wanted to do this, or came to someone else and wanted to do pastoral ministry and their wife wasn't on board with it, I think my initial thought would just for any person kind of wanting to pursue pastoral ministry to say, well, let's take our time and work through this and see where we're going. But that would be my sort of initial bit of advice for anybody, whether that's a spouse being on board or whether they're just not sure exactly what all the details look like. I think in general, I know we've gotten a little bit of a hard time about making this process so slow, but that's just been an effort on our part to say, let's make sure we're getting this right. And so anybody that's thinking about this, but they're not really sure they're ready to step in that direction for whatever reason, especially for spousal reasons, I think that would be the first bit of information I would get is let's just take our time, let's move through this slowly and make sure we're all on the right page.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it is important that your spouse is on board as well. My first time going on an elder board, a gentleman was coming off, and he made a comment that I've never forgotten. And he just kind of said that, you know, you have to make sure you're in prayer and reading your Bible, because there's a spiritual impact when you're in a position like that. And that's important for your spouse as well. I just echo Chris, you know, we think that your first priority is to your family. And like I said, so if your spouse is not on board, hey, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but let's just slow down and work through it. So, but yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Is everybody's voted in for the elders, are they compensated, or is this strictly just like right now, Sam, or the rest of the nation be compensated also?
No, all the pastor elders will not be compensated. Sam is now, and what we're looking into is we will have a ratio of paid to non-paid elders. So, however big it gets, our goal is to have more non-paid than paid.
Yeah, I think our understanding of, especially the First Timothy text, is that the office is sort of independently established without regard to pay at all. But then when Paul deals with the practical aspect in 1 Timothy 5, he says those elders that lead well, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching, essentially says they deserve to get paid. And so, now obviously there are various circumstances. Paul in Corinth chose not to get paid because he felt like it would be a better avenue for the gospel. But I think what we're trying to do ahead of time is get that sort of picture, the financial picture out of it initially, just to make the establishment of this is what we believe the office looks like. But yeah, practically, we just think it's helpful to have people who aren't in the daily grind to provide sort of an outside perspective for people like Sam and Rick, who are kind of doing it every day, just to give them another perspective from someone who's not spending quite as much time doing it. So, and I think we mentioned it, but just to reiterate, Rick is also getting paid as well at this point. So.
There's an opportunity, as you know, for you guys to be the first that we have to possibly meet elders, and then anyone who comes subsequently after that, to really get to know them, not to just be a name on a piece of paper, say, okay, you know, I'm such and such, you know, and really kind of flesh out those, okay, this is what I kind of think that these are my qualifications, kind of hear testimony, what, you know, the Lord has done in our lives, just to get to know them before that they would be selected as an elder.
No, that's a great question. The question was related basically the guys to be candidates for eldership, get to know them more personally, who they are. And I believe that's kind of, I guess, why we do the second Q&A, is be more of a personal, where you guys can ask us more personal questions about us and who we are, what we believe, and you know, our families and stuff like that. And this is really, am I talking quietly? And so that's going to be the process too. And also, you know, we're working on, I know Chris is working on a process for people who do want to become elders, who have that desire to become elders. And that's where, you know, if you come forward, like even right now, kind of give a little bit of time right now to come forward if you're interested in that, but then, you'll come to the meetings and you'll kind of get to see who we are afterwards. You know, we try to record a couple of meetings because it's always sometimes kind of weird, and we have some fun with it. But that'd be one good way, you know, if you are aspiring and you do feel led to be an elder, you know, we'll invite you to the meetings. You guys can come hang out with us and we'll, you know, see what we'll talk about and go through some detail items that way. But yeah, and actually we encourage all of you to approach us individually, you know, even after church, so we just kind of, you know, hang out, socialize, clean up, it'll happen, but we can do that after all that. Come talk to us, you know, we'd love to get to know you. If we haven't known you already, but you know, some of you know who we are, but some of you don't know who we really are, you know, and vice versa. So that's very important.
So the second question session will be different than this, it'll be?
No, I think that the sessions will be the same. So since we jumped into that, the timeline is December 2nd. If you're feeling called, that's when all the names have to be in. And then January 13th and 27th right now are scheduled to be Q&A sessions where everyone who has put their name in the hat will sit up here and you guys will get to ask them questions.
Will they share testimonies too, or?
We can, that might be a good thing if you're asked that. We can share testimonies. So that'll be, now we know on the 20th and the 27th, there's a conflict that has come up since we originally made that schedule. We are holding off to see if any other names come in, to see if there's maybe further conflict. So right now, we're going forward with the 20th and the 27th. The 13th and the 27th. So after December 2nd, once we get to talk to all the candidates and make sure those dates are good, we'll put out a time, and if need be, it might change. But as of now, it's the 13th and the 27th. So, and then on February 10th will be the pastor elder vote in our annual meeting. And so that'll be when you guys vote on all the candidates, and it is an individual vote for each member, not a collective for the whole. Richard.
This question, this song came up a couple of days ago. I wasn't gonna ask this question, but the things that led to it. Is there gonna be an ordination service? And if you become an elder, are you an elder for us in this church? Even though you're becoming inactive? Have you thought through that? I realize it's kind of a new thought.
So the question was, will we have an ordination service, and then are you a pastor elder for life? Ordination service, we haven't talked about that. So I don't think we will. As far as pastor elder for life, yes, you're a pastor elder for life. No terms. We are working through a sabbatical process. If you need to take time off, you can do so. But the reason, right, for paid and non-paid. The reason for life is that we feel if you're called for as long as you feel you can continue to do it, or until you become disqualified. That doesn't mean you have to serve for life. It means you can come on, and it can be a year, and you can say, hey, life's in the way, and I need to step down. And then that's also why there's a vote every 2 years on affirmation. But yes, so that would be for as long as you feel called to, or you disqualify yourself.
So are you basically saying then that the group will grow, that there won't be people that step aside for a season as elders? You will now go from 4 men to eventually 6 men, to maybe 8 men, to 10 men, 5 men? What's that look like?
Yeah, so Ken's question was, as we continue to grow, is there a cap? Is that fair? A limit on the number, basically?
Well, I'm just looking in terms of, even if the congregation doesn't grow, but you continue to bring more men on. Is there anything that says what that number looks like, or what that?
No, we don't have a number yet. That's a good question I haven't talked about, but I think as long as a man feels called, to be an elder, and he meets all the qualifications, then I don't see why we would limit that. Any other? But that's a great question. We really hadn't thought through that, especially in the context of, if it remained the same. But Bill.
Well, my thinking is that if every man in the church wanted to be an elder, we should be shepherds for the people. We should watch out for one another. We should, it came to the point that every man had the qualifications to be an elder and wanted to be an elder, it'd be a great church with a lot of strength.
Yeah, Bill's comment was if all men wanted to be elders, it'd be a great church, and amen to that.
And then the other comment is, one thing I'd like for you all to think about, maybe not answer right now. The thing that I see as I watch the church grow and change is that you're not getting in the way of the Holy Spirit, that God is doing the work. God is bringing in the people that He wants here. God is bringing different talents in people. And in the past, I've seen elder boards get in the way of that. They take over what God is doing. So I think
So Bill's comment was not getting in the way of the Holy Spirit and God's bringing people to the church and people to the elder board as well. Is that fair?
And to use their talent.
And so they can use their talents as God is so gifted, yes.
And not have our own agenda, right?
I love that point, Bill, because if you look at the qualifications in 1 Timothy and Titus, you can find every one of those qualifications commanded of all believers throughout the rest of the scriptures. I mean, some people have said what's so unique about the qualifications of elders in the New Testament is that they're so ununique. They're just basically expressions of what the Christian faith should look like. And so the way I think of it is it's someone who's qualified to be pastor elder is someone whose life has been taken hold of by the gospel, and they really live that out in a consistent way. And so it's really not, and as Bill was pointing out, I mean, this should be something that everybody's doing. So if we, if we go to the pastor elders or try to give the impression that they're the only ones that can do it, then we've moved in the wrong direction.
And two, one of the things we talk about a lot is, we're not worried about the number of people here. So we're more concerned about the quality than the quantity. So it's like we want to, teach you guys and get into your lives and build you and have you walk closer with Christ than getting butts in the seats. That's not something that's ever been a concern to us. And to me, I thought of if we ended up having more elders than people, then I'd say, well, then we need to go start these 5 churches. Let's go. What are we doing with other elders? But again, that's it's something I know some people talk about a lot. Is we got a lot of mega churches that surround us. It's not what we're looking for at all. That's not even what I thought. I can tell you, 2 years ago, it was me, Rick, and Sam and our wives sitting together. And we looked at each other and said, now what? What I mean? And we're going to start this church, and we chose February 5th to start. So I always thought it was too early. The rest of us nope, let's just go for it. And I think there's maybe, 10 of us that first Sunday. So almost 2 years later, and again, Bill, you're right. This is nothing but the Lord's doing, stuff with the Holy Spirit. I know the Lord just keeps answering prayers when it comes to just even little things like Martin and I having them show up and the Lord meeting them here. That was on this poor man's heart for a long time. And it's getting somebody up there to play guitar and can sing, just little things like that where we just, instead of rushing it, we could have paid somebody to come up here and do that. That's not what we're about. And so we waited on that, we prayed on that, and little things like that, the Lord answered. So it's very important, and so I just want you guys to know that's where our mindsets are at. It's more the quality than quantity. The size doesn't matter. So I just want to kind of share that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Bit off subject, but who is eligible to vote?
All of you right now, because we have an established membership now. It's something we have been talking about. You have seen it on the newsletter. We had written out the document on that, but that's not something we're ready for yet. So as of right now, it's just all of you. And like I said, Rick said, it's more of a confirmation vote from you guys on us. Every 2 years we do more of an affirmation vote after that, which will be more within the elder board versus the congregation. So yeah, but this first one will be all of you. So we're just not. Membership is out there, it's talked about, but we don't feel like we're ready. We're not there about it.
I think Chris does a great job of explaining that confirmation and affirmation.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so the reason that the pattern we've used that way is again, going back to 1 Timothy and Titus. If you look at what Paul is doing there, he sends Titus, he sends Timothy, he says, I want you to appoint elders so you can confront false teaching. But actually, he personally says, confront false teaching, and a way to do that is to appoint elders. But if you look at the end of both of those books, Paul says, I want you to come to me here at so-and-so, or such and such. And so the idea is Timothy and Titus are leaving. And so basically what he's saying is, Titus, I want you to do this in Crete. And when you leave, I want the elders to continue to do those things. And same for Titus, or Timothy, I want you to do these things in Ephesus, but when you leave, I want the elders to continue to do those things. And so that's where we kind of formed the opinion that the Bible basically gives a pattern church leadership basically continues to appoint church leadership. Well, the difficulty here is we don't have that sort of outside verification for any of us at this point. And so what we want to do is not just say, well, we're going to put ourselves in that position, because we don't think that's a biblical way to do it. And so what we're trying to do is basically open ourselves up to be assessed by those candidates, or by those questions, and say, since we don't have that leadership structure that was in place for Timothy and Titus, how do we do the first step? I mean, down the road, once we have pastor elders, I think that it makes sense that those pastor elders could sort of appoint and explain and bring in new pastor elders, but because we're not in that position right now, this first one would be unique. And so the idea is that the confirmation term is that that vote is sort of the ultimate delineation of, like, this is going to either be a yes or no. And so, I'm putting myself as a candidate, and so if I get a 60% vote, I'm not in that position. It's not happening. The distinction will be, once we do have pastor elders, we believe they're sort of taking the prime motivation and the prime responsibility for appointing new pastor elders. And so in that case, they would sort of make the decision and have the ultimate vote on who gets to come in that position. But the affirmation vote is basically a way to say, okay, the pastor elders have chosen this person to be pastor elder. Do you guys think this is responsible? So the affirmation vote would be, are we missing something? Are the current pastor elders completely overlooking something in this person's life that needs to be known? And so by having a full congregational vote at that point, it's just basically to say, we want a testimony from the congregation, especially those people that don't feel like they have enough strength or courage to stand up and say it to a current pastor elder. This gives them a voice to say, I have concerns. And so, if the vote, in that case, the affirmation vote is a little different. So if it's a 75% affirmation vote, that's not a slam dunk case where they're not a pastor elder. We would want to, like whoever's the current pastor eldership would want to say, what's the reason for that vote? Are there questionable things in their life that no, they shouldn't be a pastor elder? But if the reason 25% of people said no is because he's a little bit of a boring preacher, that normalizes is not enough to disqualify someone. But if in that affirmation vote it brings out through the process that there is disqualifying reasons that this person shouldn't be there, then that's the role of the affirmation vote. So again, we see the biblical pattern being pastor elders sort of carry this process on and take the main responsibility for choosing new leadership. But because of the kind of uniqueness of our situation with this church plant, we want this first vote to be a true outside testimony of whether or not we're actually living up to our end of the qualifications.
Two questions. So this will act as the board, so to speak, of the church. First question. Second, and I agree with the 80%, but has there been any thought that can be incredibly painful to somebody if they put themselves as their, have you thought about shepherding somebody through, hey, you didn't make it? Because obviously if they put themselves out there.
So Dan's question was, if someone's gone through this process, and it won't be a fast process, where they make themselves known as a candidate, and they don't get the 80% vote at the meeting of February 10th, have we thought about how the pastor elders at the time will shepherd someone through that process? I'm elected.
I think that's a great question. But I think that's part of it, because it says, you have to open yourself to a public question. And part of that, I guess, the 4 or 5 of us up here, we're prepared to go through that. But ultimately, you have to, to stand up here and go through that and not get voted in. I mean, that's fine, because it's your church. We're more, what we hope to accomplish is we're not leaders as in we're Coca-Cola board here. We're servants. And if you don't choose us, then that's fine. And see, I'm getting old because I lost my train of thought on your next question. Yeah, he said it too.
So will it act?
Yeah.
Board use
Yes.
the term lose?
But then further, so let's say 6 years down the road, there's a couple gentlemen that want to go through the process. They will sit up and do a public Q&A as well. And hopefully, what we accomplish in that time is that if there's any objections with the person, then they're raised at that time, or if any of the members have to find something that would disqualify the person, they could come to one of the other pastor elders and bring that up, and then we would have that discussion with them. So hopefully our process is such that that happens few and far between, because we're putting someone forward who we think is qualified and will meet that. But it could happen. But I think that's part of being, aspiring to do this. And there's nothing. I don't think there's nothing wrong with not getting the vote. I mean, it's not like, you're not bloodlust by anybody. You're still a part of the church. But we want to set the bar high for those who will be pastor elders. So.
About that. I think part of the question is, will we do something? Will we coach that person along? They don't get voted, right?
Has there been
Is there-
thought of
Right.
shepherding that person? Because I get what you're saying, but it can still, for some people, be incredibly painful.
Right, and it would hurt. And I think we've talked about it briefly about that, but if they didn't get the vote, not to, again, just say you're out. Like, you're done, have a nice day, get out of here. It would be more like, let's figure out why, then, and go alongside that person and help them get to where, 2 years later, when it comes to time for next year, they can do it again. Yeah, I mean, again, everything, this whole process, like we've been doing, it's been really slow, but there's a purpose for doing this slow. And we just want to make sure we do get all the details right and think through things like that. So these are some good questions you guys are asking. There's a couple that we really haven't talked much about. We probably should put a little more thought into that. So we appreciate those questions. But yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be like we just put them out. It would be more like, let's get them to the side and talk to them and see what it's about. And where can we work? Where's their weakness? Where's their strengths? What do we need to work on? So, it's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good point, and actually, I think the way the process will be set up after this will prevent a lot of that, because I would say it's probably going to be a small percentage where several pastor elders would say we think this person is indeed qualified, and that they would get up front and be voted on with a really low affirmation vote. So, but this first one's unique in that way, so I think that is a good point. Hopefully, if any one of us is in that position, we have the humility to be able to move forward, but you're right. But I think the process that will be a little more definitive and permanent down the line will reduce the likelihood of that too. So.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So I've been trying to put together through a lot of our discussions what we're basically just calling at this point like a pastor elder handbook, and this actually speaks to what Margie asked earlier. But again, there's going to be stuff built in there. Much of it will be character assessment. Thinking, do I meet these qualifications? Have I thought these things through? Do the other men who are assessing me think these things are true? Does the congregation as a whole feel that these things are true? Those are all important. And then again, in my mind, I see evaluation questions that would identify weak areas of character that could be improved upon. And some of those are not things that are readily amenable to changes, but the things like hospitality, you think, well, that's an area I could work on. Over the next 3 months, let's think about a way where we're inviting more people into our home, or we're getting to know people better. Let's think about some ways to improve hospitality. On the doctrinal teaching side of it, I think those are things where we would say, well, let's put them in a situation to learn it, go through a class and learn how to teach a little bit better. Or, there's so many resources available online now to find good doctrinal biblical teaching. There's so many resources available, and so all of that will be part of this process where the handbook will basically be sort of, this is what we think about pastor elders in general, this is what the qualifications are, and this is how we sort of assess ourselves at the beginning and on an ongoing basis. And then the second half of the book will ultimately talk a little bit about what's it look like when we work together, what do meetings look like, what do votes look like, address your point, Dan, about how are decisions made in this process. I think Rick's done a good job of thinking in this area, but if there's a conflict between two pastor elders, the idea would be that we would kind of set them out of the decision-making process as the investigation goes on to figure out what exactly happened. And that the same would be true of a pastor elder and someone who's not a pastor elder. that obviously we'll listen to the sides of the story and think that through, but the ultimate question would be, we want to make sure we're being objective in the decision-making process. And so a lot of the book will actually be like, how are these things happening? What does shepherding look like? What does the day-to-day look like for paid pastor elders? What does the normal shepherding function process look for non-paid pastor elders, and so on? So hopefully, I mean, that's still a work in progress, but hopefully that'll be something that we can continue to sharpen so that whoever is in this position in the future will be someone who's really thinking these things through and trying to improve in those areas. But I think Jerry had his hand up.
Yeah, on the next second Q&A, are you guys going to give your testimonies, explain what you do for a living, blah, 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 so we get to know you better than what we know now? Not that I don't know about anything now.
Let's say yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think that.
We don't want to talk about that, but that's a great.
Okay, I just guess.
Q&A, so what you guys want to ask us about. What's your?
Yeah. But I think the other reason we've kind of intentionally put a time gap in between the announcing them on December 9th is to say, these are the people who are the candidates. You know, the onus is on them to try to get to know other people, but we would also be an invitation to anyone else to say, like, try to reach out to them as well to try to get to know them. But yeah, the Q&A is sort of the bottom line. Like, if you haven't had a chance to meet them, or if you don't know anything about it, we want to at least provide some information. I think the testimony, at least, if not more, makes a lot of sense.
Mary has a question.
Yeah, you guys are talking about people being pastor elders for life, and then somebody mentioned disqualification. If there were to be an issue, would it go first before the pastor elders? Because obviously you're accountable to God, but you're also accountable to the church. So what would that look like?
So the question was about disqualifying elements of the pastor elder. And so we'll just give a very kind of gross, negligent example. If one of the pastor elders you know, has an affair on their wife and commits adultery, what would that process look like? And I think a lot of that will be spelled out in the handbook in terms of how decisions are made, but that's a perfect example of where you know, clearly that person would be involved in the vote. And in a situation like that, it would initially go to the pastor elders, but something that blatant, something that blatant would be I think, dealt with. But the First Timothy actually gives some instruction on this. So it says, you know, pastor elders who lead well should be considered worthy of double honor. But then it follows that with basically, don't admit a charge against a pastor and elder except on the basis of 2 or 3 witnesses. And then if they do, it says basically bring it before the church. And so that's certainly even a deterrent to some of those things, is to say, like, if someone is on the pastor elder position and they do commit a sin like that, even if it's not a disqualifying sin, there is some expectation that that's going to become known to the church, not just to discipline, but just to encourage them to, again, have an area of growth. But if it's something that, you know, seems to clearly disqualify someone based on those qualifications, I think we would need to work out the details of what the formal process would be. But I think the initial step would be the pastor elder board. Margie?
Is there, in this schema, is there a greater, or what kind of liability is covering the individuals and the church? I mean, is there a greater amount of liability insurance that needs to be had? And how do we protect the elders, pastor elders? Is there more liability that they're incurring? Does that make sense?
So is this kind of from a legal standpoint?
From a legal standpoint.
So the question is there, since there won't necessarily be the same amount of function between each person, so some people will be committing more hours than other people, will there be any difference in the liability, or will it sort of be the same across the board? Is that?
Yeah, I'm just thinking liability. I'm thinking the world.
Yeah.
But I mean, clearly, like, we have a board insurance. So is there insurance for liability for each member? Because you're incurring more risk.
Yeah, I don't really even know where to go with that.
No, that's a great question, because we have a liability policy, but I don't know. I don't think it extends to you. I know it extends to our stuff and to liability to, like, if we damage this building, but that's a great question as to personal liability for us. So I'm gonna make a phone call to our insurance guy this week. But thank you. That's a great question though, yes.
That's what we got. She's got like $10 million liability policy for Esperanza Ministries.
Yeah.
To ensure the board members and any volunteers that are
Yeah.
ministering in the event that someone sues because of
Right.
a volunteer.
Teresa can help us.
Directors and officers level.
Okay.
Thank you.
And one of practices level.
Ken?
Well, I was just gonna say that what you're talking about, you have general liability
Mhm.
policy,
Right.
and that's not what is needed.
Okay.
It's when there's gonna be some kind of problem, per se, that you could be getting into.
Yeah.
Good to bring that up.
Yeah.
It's something I guess we.
Yeah, I never thought of that, so.
Anything else? Anyone else?
Jeff?
If you could narrow it down to, well, I'm kind of formulating this question as I'm speaking, so excuse the way I put this, but I'm looking to hear from you guys in a very short sentence or two, how should the people go about determining if somebody is or would be a good elder? Like, we know what the qualifications are, and it's something that every believer should be doing. So what sets this group of men apart? What should this group of people be doing to say, if we want our church to truly be led by the Holy Spirit and to honor Jesus Christ, what should we be looking at? What's the secret sauce that we got to make sure that we see in this?
That's gonna be our next T-shirt. That's awesome.
Can you repeat this?
Yeah, basically he's asking, he wants each of us to talk about briefly what we, in like a couple of sentences, explain what makes an elder qualified. Basically, what makes a difference between four of us up here and you sitting out there. The main question is, well, there's really no difference. I mean, these three men have been elders before, I haven't, so all this is new for me. And for me, it's like it's a lot to take in. It really is. I'm going to be completely honest. Because the more we get deeper into this, the more I learn about what true eldership is. It's a heavy work. It really is. But to me, it's the only really difference. And like Bill said, the qualifications, it's just a standard list of qualifications. There's nothing special really about those qualifications. The only thing that makes that different is that man truly living that out every day. You know, and whether it's not just here, it's not just on Sundays. It's it's every day at work. Like three of us, me, Chris, and Conrad, we work full time. Me being as a truck driver, you guys know I'm a driver, there's sometimes it's difficult for me to be, perfectly like that all day long with the way people drive nowadays and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I mean, to me, it's like if you're looking for a man and you think he's qualified, it's because that man stands out. It's because that man, he does live the life according to the gospel. He does do everything in his efforts to be in his word every day. He does that, to walk, like our slogan is, our saying is, our kind of mission statement is walk daily in the gospel. To me, that's what would be the biggest difference, is that man, and if he's truly walking in the Lord, he's truly walking in the gospel and living out every day, it's going to show by who he's surrounded by. I heard something I listened to, I think it was one of 9 Mark's videos, but their elder board, after they have an assessment of the elders, men who aspire to be elders coming in, they actually call their office. They call their place of employment and ask them questions like, tell me what, they can call my boss and say, tell me about Craig. What's he like there at work? Like that, and they go that deep with it because they want to know, is he honorable everywhere he's at? So to me, that's the biggest difference. Are we walking in the gospel daily? Are we truly living it out, or are we not? So, because again, the qualifications really should be something we all aspire to get to, and to be, to actually be an elder. Do you live that out? Do you understand that? And what it's going to amount to? So, that's my point.
Brother, for me, I better be close to Jesus, and I better be hiding the word in my heart. And I think for me, that's the bottom line, because I think if that's the case, if you're close to the Lord, you're loving the Lord, and you're hiding the scripture in your heart, then you have a love for his people. You have a love to shepherd his people. You have a love to see people come together and commit to one another. And I would say that, what I would say.
I think to boil it down, obviously, like Craig said, all the characteristics need to be there. But you know, is the person a servant or does he like to bark orders? I think that's where you're going to find who you want to be your pastor elders.
Yeah, I think similar to what we said earlier, I mean, the fact that these traits aren't all that unique stands out. And on some level means, well, pastor elders aren't any different in some ways. But the analogy I have in my mind is that you can just imagine a race where a bunch of people are running forward. People qualified to be pastor elders aren't necessarily the ones out front winning. I mean, they're not necessarily the ones that have the best Bible knowledge or you know, have the best reputation in the community. I think of them being the ones that could be out front or maybe could be towards the front, but instead of chosen back, and they're standing next to each other saying, let's go, let's do this together, let's move forward. And so I think the things that Sam said that get you there are they people that encourage you to be more like Jesus? When you're around these people, do you want to be more like Jesus? Do you want to grow in your faith? Or are they people that kind of get on your nerves and make you a little more critical and make you less of a loving person? I think if they're the kind of person, when you're around, they have an infectious love of Jesus, and you're like, man, I just want to get to know Jesus. That's the kind of people that you really want to look for. And I think the only way you can do that is to get to know them and see where they're at.
My question is, before I ask my question, I just want to say this. I know the leadership right now is being set up. Trying to set up the leadership. So, what I've seen over the years, even from Liberia to the U.S., many times when, you know, new churches, you know, trying to establish in terms of membership growth, it's always like, you know, new members coming from other churches, you know, coming to the new church. And that happens because the new church, they always, you know, in the process of setting up new ideas, bringing out new ideas and strategies, you know, that will attract the other members out there to come to the church. And since I came to the U.S., I've seen that a lot. I think that is even happening in Harvest. I met the pastor, Pastor Burke, I told him about it. You know, in Florida, I told Pastor Peter about it. The church there is growing because there is this, you know, great ideas and people are leaving their churches coming to the new church. So my concern, I think I brought this to Pastor Sam the first time we met. My concern is this is a very new church coming up. You know, I said to my brother before, Yala, that you think that Jesus was to physically appear right now in Morovia, he would come to your church first. He would come to, he would go to the other churches around and really serving him, know him. Or he would go to the red light district where the prostitute or criminals are. I say, honestly, I believe he would not come to the church because he doesn't want people to die not knowing him, not hearing the gospel. And that's why before he left, he gave this great commission, Matthew 28, go out. So my question is the leadership of this church really thinking about trying to set that different? You know, really reaching out to the people. I heard you saying we're not really looking at quantitativity, we're looking at quality, and that's really good. I don't want to be part of church that is just way big. And people don't even know each other. People just being on Sunday and happy, and after service, that's just it. But this relationship is not there with Jesus. And the most important thing is we all will die. And when we die, we will stand before God. And are we really reaching out in the community, trying to bring new members who have never heard the gospel? You know, for me, that is always my mind. And when I have the opportunity to talk to somebody, you know, I want to share my faith with them. So is there any plan with this leadership to really strategize reaching out the gospel to people who have not heard the gospel, you know, to add to the church?
I want to make sure I get your question right. So I think it's a good concern. So his concern is that oftentimes when there's a new church, it can look like it's growing in numbers, but when in reality it's not necessarily reaching the community, it's actually just pulling in people from other churches. And so his question is, has the current leadership thought about that dynamic and how we're really reaching the lost people in this community? This won't get at all of your points here, Cora. I would say one thing, my initial impression of this church, I came here probably 4 to 5 months after it started. I think one of the things that encouraged me most about it is all the people I talked to said, look, you don't have to come here. We want you need to take your family where you're going to grow and where you're going to become more like Jesus. And so I'd say, at least from my perspective as an outsider coming in, there was almost a reluctance to just say, yeah, come on in, we want the numbers. It was almost like, no, you need to make sure this is where the Lord's leading you. And so it was a neat perspective. It wasn't say, yeah, come on in, we'll get you involved, we'll do these things. It was, you need to make sure this is where the Lord's got you first. And so on the one hand, I'm encouraged by that. That doesn't address reaching non-believers specifically, but it does show, at least I think there's a heart so far in this church that's not about bringing in people from stealing from other churches, right? As far as reaching out to the community, I know we can certainly always grow in that area. And I'd say my understanding of what the way church functions is that when we meet together here, it's to build up one another and encourage one another so that all of us together can go back out in the community. And so I think you're right. There should be a tendency to see newer non-believers attending, not necessarily because this is where people come to get saved. But the church should really be going out to the community to preach the gospel, to get the commission out there. And then once those people become believers, then they can come back and join together so that we can go out again. But I think there's always areas where we can improve on that. And so if any of you have specific thoughts on ways that we can reach those people, because I think you're exactly right. The religious people of Jesus' day hated him because he didn't want their religious mentality. He wanted people to come to know Jesus Christ. He wanted people to be saved from eternal damnation. And so I think that's always an important reminder. And I know we don't ever do it as well as we could, so we would ask for your help on that for sure.
We did start a little bit of outreach when we first started the church. It's called Salt and Light. And that was, people within the church who needed help. And, we could go help them with even little things. Like, I think we helped somebody, or like go to Patty, like lay their mulch, stuff like that. Used to be a little bit of outreach for that. But I think this is a greater concern we need to be thinking about. It's something that's always on our minds. But right now, I know we've been more focused on this, getting the church kind of set up, calling of elders and pastor elders. So I know for me, I will be honest with you, that hasn't been my first thought, but it is definitely a thought, and that's something we have discussed a little bit about trying to find different things out there that we can, as a church, go help with. Whether it's Habitat for Humanity or public houses or anything, something like that we can, food pantries, so we can go help serve people out there and share the gospel with people in that manner. So that's definitely something we are thinking about going forward. And again, things like this, guys, that's why we opened this up to you. Like Salt and Light, it's still there, but obviously we haven't been really active on it. But it's where if you guys have any suggestions like that, please feel free to tell us. Come talk to us. Come up with suggestions. If somebody in the church needs help, then let's figure that out. And together we'll see how we can help them. But Yeah, I mean, outreach is very important, and we definitely will be needed as we move on. I would say the next, the 5-year plan would be we get a lot more active in the community as a whole.
A family in this church that really does that well is Conrad and Emily Goboff. I've learned a lot by just listening to them and watch them live among their neighbors. They live in a cul-de-sac, and they know all their neighbors. They have their neighbors over their house quite a bit, and I think they're a really good family to talk to about what that's looked like. I know that challenges me, but I think one of the huge challenges we face, whether we're talking about Foundation Life, we're talking about Harvest, we're talking about Elevation, whoever we're talking about around this area, is that not many people that are lost even have a desire to come to church anymore. And I think that dynamic is changing. And so there's a lot of playing musical chairs within churches, but we certainly need to grow in evangelism and what that looks like. So I've been praying, recently about what that looks like just in my connections, in my circles, because I get an opportunity to share with people, but at the same time, too, most of the folks that I speak to, whether that's somebody I run into at the coffee, drinking coffee or whatever else, or just somebody in my circles, really the church has lost its relevance. And so I think that's a real challenge we face, and something that we have to, just understand that's reality moving forward. But I can tell you this, I believe that all of us are to commit to each other, as Chris was saying, commit to each other out of reverence to Christ, submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. And I think, as we come together, the mindset is, okay, who has God put in my circles to share the gospel? Who has the Lord put in my circles to continue to talk about Him, acknowledge Him, speak about who He is in our life? So I think that's something we certainly need to grow in. Yes, and thank you for your question, McCoy.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is just that, I work in kind of an academic context, and so people I've known over the last few years, atheism is rampant in the context I'm around, and a vast majority of those people would never be caught dead in a church building. And so I think the other element of this is that as a church as a whole, it's important to be doing events and ministries and stuff to reach out, but I think perhaps even more important than that is that we begin to build a mindset that it's not my church's job to witness to the people I know. It's my job. And so that, I think, is the mentality that we need to build. And so when I look at the people around me who haven't heard the gospel, it really should bring conviction to my soul that I'm not reaching out the way I should. And so I think perhaps even more fundamental than the specific ministries of doing this is just building a culture that when we go back out into the world, we need to really understand that there are people around us who are lost that will never come into a church building. And if we individually are not doing that, those people will never hear the gospel in our context. So I think that's probably the fundamental attitude I would like to see built into the church ultimately.
Yeah, just to add on that too, is just, we go out there, churches mainly grow because the people are excited about what's happening at the church. They're excited about Jesus. So it's, we've got to talk about the qualifications, of an elder and how all that works. Again, it's, if we're living life, if we're following the gospel, we're walking, living life in the gospel every day, we're excited. We should have this joy about us that confuses people like atheists. They're like, why are you this way? And it opens the door to explain and to share the gospel with them. So I think it's just, again, it's all of us being excited about what the Lord's doing here and the future that we have here. And you guys, in your circles, as Sam always says, in your community where you work, where you grocery shop, where you eat lunch, where you eat dinner, there's constant opportunities there to constantly share Christ with people and just be excited and invite them to church. Or if not, they don't want to come to church, and that's where invite them to your home, and then stuff like that. So and let them see what you're like. The greatest evangelism thing you can do is just be the example. If you're living the life, you're walking the gospel, or walking into the gospel, you are the greatest example. Just always remember that. That's just what I want to say. All right. Any other questions? Dear Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity we have today to gather together as a body, Lord, to just continue to learn about you, Lord, to mature about you, and Lord, just as we grow as a church family, Lord, as we continue on, Lord, that we just again follow your spirit, Lord, that you lead us, and you've formed Foundation Life to how you see fit, Lord. I mean that the leadership currently, the leadership to come, Lord, as we go through the process of calling elders, Lord, that we will constantly keep the focus on you, Lord, and that your Holy Spirit will guide this church into the future, Lord. Lord, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity we had to, again, gather together to worship you today. In heaven and earth. Amen. Thank you, guys.
Thanks for all the questions. This is really helpful.